The trailer backed up to the levee at dawn, and by the time the tailgate dropped, half the road had already heard about it on the phone. 40 ducks, Dale Kirby said into his own phone, standing at his truck window with the engine running, watching Nora Whitfield's hired boy carry crate after crate of quacking, shoving birds down toward the flooded paddy. 40 ducks, Earl, in the rice. She's lost her mind out there. Nobody on that road needed convincing. Rice farming along that stretch of bottomland had been done the same way for 3 generations. Flood the field, spray for the weevils and the armyworms, and the barnyard grass on schedule, drain it down at the right week, and pray the weather held, and nothing in that long. Careful tradition had room in it for 40 domestic ducks paddling through a 35-acre paddy like it was a city park pond. Nora Whitfield stood at the field's edge in rubber boots gone soft with age, watching the birds fan out across the water, and said nothing to the boy hauling crates, except to mind the gate latch on the last one. Because a duck loose on the levee road before the fence was finished would just give the road one more thing to laugh about. Every farmer on that road called her rice fields a joke. Then harvest came, and none of them had a joke left to tell. What none of them knew that morning, what Nora had never explained to a soul beyond her hired hand. Because explaining it invited exactly the kind of ridicule now, idling at her fence line in a diesel pickup, was what her grandmother Opal had told her 40 years before, standing ankle-deep in that same mud with a coffee can of duckling feed in one hand, about a method of growing rice that didn't need a chemical drum anywhere near the water. Opal Whitfield had grown up on a delta far from that southern county, in a country whose name most of the road couldn't have found on a map, where her own mother had raised rice and ducks together in the same flooded fields the way her mother had before her. A practice old enough that nobody there thought to call it anything but simply how rice was grown. She had married an American serviceman after the war, followed him home to a rice county that had never heard of the method and wasn't especially curious to learn, and had spent the rest of her life growing a garden instead of a rice crop, because a woman with an accent and a foreign farming tradition had quickly learned, in that place and that decade, which battles were worth fighting and which weren't. She had kept the knowledge anyway, quietly, and passed it to her granddaughter the way people pass down things they suspect might not survive them otherwise, in stories told over a coffee can of feed, in a girl's small hands learning to hold a day-old duckling without crushing it. In a single sentence Opal repeated so often across Nora's childhood summers that it had worn as smooth and familiar as a stone carried in a pocket. Rice doesn't need poison, Opal used to say. It needs company. Opal had died when Nora was 22, quietly, in her sleep, in the same small house at the edge of the farm she'd lived in for 40 years, and it was only after the funeral, going through a cedar chest nobody had opened in a decade, that Nora found the coffee can itself, rusted through at the seams but still holding a handful of dried corn and a folded sheet of paper in her grandmother's careful, foreign-schooled handwriting, a rough diagram of a flooded paddy with small circles scattered across it, each one labeled in a mix of English and her grandmother's native script, timing notes for when ducklings should enter the water and when they needed to come back out before the grain came in. Nora had kept that paper folded in the same cedar chest for 20 years without fully understanding what she was keeping, the way a person keeps a language they were never quite taught to speak fluently, present but dormant, waiting on an occasion to be used. Nora had been 8 years old the first time she heard it, and hadn't understood a word of what it meant. She understood it fully at 44, standing at the edge of her late father's rice ground the spring after she'd finally worked up the nerve and the finances to try what her grandmother had told her about for 3 decades, and what every extension bulletin and land grant study she'd since read late at night at her kitchen table confirmed was not folklore at all, but a documented, centuries-old integrated farming method that had simply never made it to this particular stretch of American bottomland. She had inherited the farm 2 years before that, when her father's knees finally gave out on him for good, and he decided, without much ceremony, that 35 acres of rice ground belonged to whichever of his children wanted it enough to fight for it. And only Nora had raised her hand. Her marriage had ended the year before that, quietly, without the kind of scandal the road might have enjoyed gossiping about. Just two people who had grown into different shapes than the ones they'd married. And she had come back to the farm with a set of divorce papers in one box and her grandmother's coffee can stories in the back of her memory, looking, though she hadn't quite named it to herself yet, for a version of her life that felt entirely her own to answer for. Rice, conventionally farmed on that road, ran on a chemical schedule as regular as church, a pre-emergent herbicide before the flood went on, a residual weed treatment 2 weeks after, an insecticide pass for the rice water weevil once the larvae showed up chewing roots, sometimes a second insecticide pass if the armyworms came heavy that year. Nora had grown up watching her father run that schedule and had run it herself the first season she took the ground over, and had done the arithmetic that every rice farmer on that road did without much comment, $210 an acre in chemical inputs that year, on top of the diesel and the seed and the water. Money that left the farm every spring whether the harvest justified it or not. She spent that first winter reading instead of resting, the extension bulletins and the university studies she could find on integrated rice duct systems, cross-referencing them against her grandmother's half-remembered instructions the way a person checks a story passed down in the family against whatever version made it into a book somewhere. The method, stripped to its bones, was simple enough to explain in a sentence, though executing it correctly took more care than the sentence let on. Introduced ducklings to a flooded paddy roughly 2 weeks after transplanting, once the rice had rooted deep enough that young ducks paddling and dabbling through the water wouldn't uproot the tender plants. And let the birds do, continuously and for free, what a chemical schedule did in scheduled, expensive bursts. Eat the weed seedlings before they could establish. Eat the snails and the leaf-eating insects that plagued young rice. Stir the mud with their constant paddling in a way that oxygenated the root zone and kept algae from choking the water, and fertilize the whole system steadily with their own droppings instead of a bagged nitrogen application. Remove the ducks before the rice headed out, before the grain formed and became something the birds themselves would gladly eat, and let the crop finish on its own. It was, on paper, a small ecosystem doing several jobs a chemical program handled separately and expensively. In practice, in a county that had never seen it done, it looked to everyone driving past on the levee road like a woman turning her family's rice ground into a petting zoo. She spent that same winter tracking down her grandmother's paper again, smoothing its brittle creases flat on the kitchen table beside a stack of university printouts, cross-checking Opal's timing notes against the extension literature and finding, to her quiet astonishment, that the two matched almost to the day. Release the ducklings roughly 14 days after transplanting. Pull them before the panicles formed, a rhythm her grandmother had carried across an ocean decades before any American land-grant university had bothered to study it. It felt, doing that work at the kitchen table some nights past midnight, less like inventing something new than like finally finishing a sentence her grandmother had left open on purpose, trusting somebody down the line to close it. She ordered 40 ducklings that first March from a hatchery 2 states over, khaki Campbells mostly, with a scattering of Indian runners mixed in, because her grandmother had always sworn the runners foraged harder for their size than any other breed, paying $6 apiece, $240 total, the smallest line item on a budget that would otherwise have run over $7,000 in chemical inputs across her whole acreage. She raised them in a brooder in the old equipment shed for their first 3 weeks, keeping the heat lamp steady, learning by trial the particular temperament of ducklings, calmer and less flighty than chickens, quicker to imprint on a routine, and by the time she released them onto the flooded paddy that first May, following her grandmother's timing to the week, they moved onto that water like they'd been waiting their whole short lives for exactly that invitation. Dale Kirby farmed the ground directly east of hers, 300 acres to her 35, and had known Nora's father for 30 years, which gave his skepticism a kind of paternal weight it might not have carried from a stranger. He stopped his truck at her fence that same week, window down, engine running, the way men on that road seemed to prefer delivering their doubts from behind a wheel rather than standing still long enough to be argued with. "Your daddy ran a clean operation," Dale said. "Sprayed on schedule, never had a weevil problem worth mentioning. You're out here letting ducks do a chemicals job, and come August, you're going to have grass up to your knees in a weevil infestation that'll make the whole road's yield average look bad by comparison, because everybody's fields sit close enough that pests move." "The ducks eat the weevil larvae before they hatch out," Nora said, not looking up from the fence stretcher in her hands. "Same for the snails. It's not new, Dale. It's just new here. Ducks eat what ducks want to eat," Dale said. "I've raised ducks. They don't work on your schedule." He drove on before she could answer that either, and Nora finished stretching the fence wire alone, the way she'd finished most conversations that spring, with the last word going unspoken, because there was no version of it that would have landed on a man already certain he knew the ending. At the co-op gym that summer, where the road's men gathered to weigh in on anything worth talking about, Nora's rice fields became the season's running entertainment, gentle at first and sharper as the weeks wore on and the ducks kept doing exactly what she'd said they would, which somehow made the mockery worse instead of better, the particular resentment of watching an unlikely thing refuse to fail on schedule. 40 ducks and no herbicide, Earl Costello said, leaning on the scale counter. "Man, that field's going to look like a slough by July. Grass thick as a hayfield." Vonda Ridley, who ran the co-op counter and liked Nora well enough to feel a little bad about it, offered the gentlest version anybody managed. "I don't doubt she knows something the rest of us don't," Vonda said, sliding a receipt across the counter. "I just don't know that duck farming and rice farming were ever meant to be the same operation is all. Woman's got a lot of nerve. I hope the nerve pays off." None of it changed what Nora did each morning, which was walk the levee at first light with a bucket of scratch feed, checking the electric mesh fence for gaps where a raccoon or a fox might test the bird's safety overnight, watching the ducks fan out across the flooded rows in loose, industrious clusters, dabbling and diving and leaving behind, wherever they'd worked, water noticeably clearer of the fine green scum of young weed growth that choked her neighbors' paddies by June. She kept a ledger in a spiral notebook her grandmother had once used for garden notes, tracking weed pressure by row, insect counts by sweep net sample, water clarity by simple observation, the kind of careful record-keeping her father had never much bothered with, and that made her, by midsummer, one of the only rice farmers on that road who could say with real certainty what was actually happening in her own field, instead of guessing from the spray calendar. The ducks themselves taught her things no bulletin had thought to mention. She learned to read their movement across the paddy the way her grandmother must once have read it, a tight. Busy cluster meaning a fresh patch of snails or larvae worth working, a loose scatter meaning the row had already been picked clean, and the birds were simply enjoying the water. She learned which corners of the field the flock avoided instinctively, and found, checking those low spots herself, standing water gone stagnant and low in oxygen. A problem she'd have taken weeks to notice by eye alone if the ducks hadn't flagged it first with their own indifference. Her hired hand, a 19-year-old named Cody Pruitt, who'd taken the summer job mostly because it paid better than the gas station, admitted by July that he'd stopped finding the ducks funny somewhere around the third week. Once he noticed the rows they'd worked stayed cleaner than the rows they hadn't, a comparison plain enough that no amount of road gossip could argue him out of it. If you've ever tried something that made perfect sense to you and no sense at all to everyone watching, you know there's a particular kind of steadiness required to keep walking that levee every morning while the whole road waits, half hoping for you to be wrong. The first season closed with numbers that surprised even Nora a little, though she'd trusted the method enough to expect something. Her yield came in at 6,800 weight per acre against a county average that year of 66. A modest edge, but a real one, achieved with 0 herbicide and 1 much-reduced insecticide pass instead of the usual 2. Saving her roughly $150 an acre in chemical costs across her whole 35 acres. She sold the duck's eggs at the farmer's market in town that fall too. A small side income she hadn't fully planned for. 60 dozen across the season at $4 a dozen. $240 that came back to her almost exactly matching what she'd spent buying the ducklings in the first place, as though the birds had quietly paid for their own existence before they'd even finished. Their first year of work. It was not, on its own, the kind of number that silenced a road full of skeptics. It was enough, though, to keep Dale Kirby's truck slowing at her fence a little longer each time he passed. The way a man slows down when a thing he's certain will fail keeps declining, too. The second season was where the method truly proved itself. Yields climbing to 7,400 hundredweight while the county average stayed flat at 65. Her chemical bill down to under $1,000 for the whole operation against a county norm still running 7,000 and climbing as input prices rose. Word of the gap moved through the co-op the way real numbers eventually move through any farming community. Slower than gossip, but far more durable, because a farmer might laugh at a neighbor's methods for a season or two, but a yield sheet posted at the co-op each fall didn't leave much room for argument once the numbers themselves started doing the talking. Dale Kirby's own yield that second season came in at 6,300 hundredweight, 2 below the county average. On ground he'd worked the same conventional way his whole career, and it was somewhere in that gap, watching his own numbers slide while hers climbed, that his skepticism began curdling into something with more edge to it than simple doubt. He came to her fence a third time that fall, not slowing this time, but stopping the truck outright, stepping down into the mud in his good boots in a way that told Nora before he said a word that this conversation was going to cost more than the last two. "Your ducks have been getting into my field," Dale said. "Found droppings and tracks along the boundary ditch 2 mornings running. I don't take kindly to livestock wandering onto my ground uninvited, and I don't much care whose grandmother taught them to do it." "My fence is solid, Dale," Nora said. "I check it every morning. If a duck got through, I'll find the gap and close it myself. Today see that you do," he said, "because next time I won't be near as polite about it." And it was the closest he'd come yet to a real threat. Delivered flat and certain the way men on that road delivered threats they intended to keep. Dressed up as reasonable boundary line grievance so that nobody standing nearby could call it anything but a neighbor protecting his own ground. She found no gap in the fence that afternoon, walked it twice, and concluded, quietly, that the tracks Dale claimed to have found belonged to something other than her ducks, though she said nothing further about it, because arguing a point with a man already decided cost more breath than it was worth. What would you have done, in Nora's place, watching a neighbor's grievance sharpen into something closer to a threat over a boundary dispute you weren't even sure existed? Nora did the only thing she'd learned, across 2 seasons of proving a method right in a place that hadn't wanted it to be, which was keep walking the levee every morning, keep the ledger current, and trust the field to keep speaking for her longer than she had patience to speak for herself. The blow, when it came, arrived from exactly the direction she hadn't been watching closely enough. Dale sprayed his own field that same week, a routine insecticide pass for an armyworm outbreak moving through the county. Timed for a Tuesday morning when the forecast called for calm air, except the wind came up harder and earlier than the forecast promised, gusting steady out of the south by mid-morning, carrying a fine drift of chemical mist a quarter-mile across the shared boundary ditch, and settling, invisible and unannounced, onto the flooded water of Nora's western paddy rows, exactly where a third of her flock had spent that whole morning working the shallows. She found them at evening feeding time, a dozen ducks dead in the mud along the western rows, another half-dozen sick and staggering, wings dragging, unable to right themselves in the water. And she stood at the edge of that paddy, in the fading light with her feed bucket still in hand, unable for a long moment to make herself walk any closer, the particular stillness of a person confronted with a loss too large to process standing up. That night, alone in her kitchen with the ledger open and unwritten in front of her, the pencil resting where she'd meant to record the day's numbers, and instead sat useless in her hand, she let herself think the thing she had not let herself think in 2 full seasons of proving the method right. Rice needs company, her grandmother used to say. Well, the company was dead in the mud along the western rows, poisoned by a neighbor's drift on a morning the wind hadn't cooperated. And maybe the whole idea had only ever worked as long as nobody around her decided her birds and her fields were worth destroying rather than tolerating. She thought about her father, about how carefully he'd avoided ever picking a fight with the road's conventional wisdom, and wondered, in the particular dark honesty of a night like that one, whether his caution had been wisdom she'd been too proud to inherit alongside her grandmother's coffee can stories. She thought, too, of Cody standing at the western fence line that evening when they'd found the birds, saying nothing for a long while before finally asking her, quiet, whether she meant to keep going after this. She hadn't had an answer for him then. She still didn't, sitting at the table with the pencil idle in her hand, and the not knowing frightened her more than the dead ducks themselves, because 2 seasons of proving the method right had never once required her to imagine what it would cost to keep proving it, after a season that started with a loss this size. She did not sleep that night. Somewhere close to 3 a.m, going back through her ledger by lamplight, she found the pattern she'd been too shaken to see earlier. Every duck lost or sickened had been working the western rows nearest the boundary ditch. None from the eastern or southern sections of the paddy. A clean geographic signature that matched precisely the drift pattern a chemical application carried on a south wind would leave. It was not proof enough for a courtroom yet. It was proof enough for her own understanding. And understanding, she realized, sitting there with the ledger open in the lamp's small circle of light, was the one thing 2 seasons of careful record-keeping had actually equipped her to produce when it mattered. She called the County Agricultural Extension Office the next morning, not Dale, not the co-op, not anyone on the road who might turn her grief into one more piece of gossip, before she'd even finished grieving it. She asked for a water sample kit and a pesticide drift consultation. And she asked, specifically, for whoever on staff had experience with integrated rice duct systems. Because she had read, the winter before, a single line in a university extension newsletter crediting a soil and water specialist named Priya Anand with running one of the only formal research trials on the method anywhere in the state. Priya Anand drove out from the extension office 3 days later, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with a soil probe kit and a clipboard, and spent the better part of a morning walking Nora's rows, taking water samples from both the affected western section and the untouched eastern rows, measuring the visible line where the drift pattern ended almost as cleanly as if someone had drawn it with a ruler. "This isn't hard to read," Priya said, crouched at the boundary ditch with a sample vial in hand. "Drift damage has a signature. Distance from the source. Concentration gradient. Timing against the spray log if your neighbor kept one. County can subpoena that log if this goes to a nuisance or damages claim." She looked up at Nora, who stood with her arms crossed against a wind that had, that morning, finally gone still. "I've read your yield numbers, by the way. Sent to us by the co-op last fall, when your numbers started outrunning the county average 2 years running. I've been hoping to find the farm behind them. I didn't expect to find it grieving a dozen dead ducks." "Neither did I," Nora said. Priya's report, filed with the county the following week, confirmed what the drift pattern had already told Nora on her own. Chemical residue consistent with the insecticide class Dale Kirby had applied that Tuesday, concentrated most heavily along the western boundary rows, consistent with an off-target drift event during elevated wind conditions that exceeded the label's application guidelines. It was not, on its own, a criminal matter. It was, under the county's agricultural nuisance ordinance, more than enough grounds for a formal mediation hearing, the kind of hearing the extension office convened maybe twice a year for exactly this sort of boundary dispute between working farms. Nora did not go into that hearing looking for a fight. She went in with 2 seasons of ledger entries, Priya's water sample report, and a decision she'd made alone in her kitchen the week before, turning the whole confrontation over the way her grandmother used to turn a stubborn knot of weed root over in her hand before deciding how best to pull it. The hearing was held in the same county extension meeting room where the annual co-op yield reports got posted every fall, a plain room with folding chairs and a table at the front, and it drew, unofficially, a fuller crowd than the county's usual boundary disputes ever managed, because word had moved through the road by then that Nora Whitfield's duck operation and Dale Kirby's spray pass were about to be laid out side by side in a room with an actual referee. Dale sat across the table with his own attorney, his jaw set the same way it had been set at her fence line weeks before, and Nora sat with Priya's report open in front of her, her grandmother's old spiral notebook beside it. 2 seasons of yield numbers and weed counts and water samples that she had never once kept for the purpose of a hearing like this one, only because careful record-keeping had been the only tool she'd ever fully trusted. The drift pattern is documented, the extension mediator said, after Priya's findings had been read into the record, after the wind data from that Tuesday morning had been pulled from the county's own weather station and matched against the timestamp on Dale's own spray log, which his attorney had been required to produce. Mr. Kirby, your application exceeded the wind speed threshold on the product label by 6 miles an hour. That's not disputable. The question in front of us is restitution, and going forward, buffer compliance along that boundary. Dale said little through most of it, the particular silence of a man watching numbers do to him exactly what they'd been doing to his own yield sheet for 2 seasons running, undeniable and unmoved by how loudly he might have preferred to argue against them. When the mediator finally turned to him for a response, he looked, for a long moment, not at the mediator or his attorney, but across the table at Nora, and something in his face had gone quieter than the bluster he'd carried to her fence line all summer. I sprayed on a bad morning, Dale said finally. Wind came up faster than the forecast said it would, and I didn't stop the pass when I should have, because I was behind schedule and didn't want to lose the day. That's on me. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's on the wind. He paused, and the room went the particular kind of still that happens when everyone recognizes a man is about to say something he means. I've been razzing you about those ducks for 2 years, Nora, mostly because your numbers were beating mine, and I didn't want to say that plain. I'm sorry about the ducks you lost. That part wasn't about the boundary line at all, and we both know it. I know, Nora said, and there was no triumph in the saying of it, only the particular tiredness of a woman who had been proven right in a way that had cost her more than she'd wanted to pay for the proving. The mediation settled that afternoon on restitution for the flock, calculated at replacement cost plus the lost season's egg income the dead birds would have produced. $600 total. Modest by any measure, but paid without argument, alongside a formal buffer agreement requiring a 100-foot no-spray zone along the shared boundary ditch going forward, wind conditions or not. Dale did something in the weeks after the hearing that surprised the whole road more than the hearing itself had. He drove out to Nora's farm on a Saturday, not in his truck idling at the fence this time, but parked and on foot, carrying a roll of electric mesh fencing he'd bought at his own expense, and offered, without much preamble, to help her extend the boundary fence the extra distance the buffer agreement required. Figured I owed you the labor, not just the check, he said. They strung fence together most of that Saturday, saying little, the way 2 people work when the words that mattered had already been said in a room with a mediator 2 weeks before. And by evening the boundary between his conventional acres and her duck-worked rows stood clearer and better fenced than it had been in either of their fathers' lifetimes. My father and yours used to argue about this same boundary ditch, Dale said, coiling the last of the wire, back before either of us were farming it ourselves. Guess some things just get inherited whether you want them or not. Guess so, Nora said. Doesn't mean they have to stay the same shape forever, though. He didn't answer that directly, only nodded, and drove home before dark with an empty fencing spool in his truck bed and, though neither of them said so, something closer to respect between the 2 properties than either set of fathers had ever quite managed to leave behind. The 3rd season closed with Nora's yield at 7,900 weight per acre, the highest on record for that stretch of the road, county average still hovering at 66, and it was that number, posted at the co-op that fall alongside every other farmer's, that finally did what 2 seasons of quiet proof hadn't quite managed on its own. Priya Anand's formal write-up of Nora's operation, submitted to the State Extension Service as a documented case study in integrated rice duck farming, drew a small delegation of agronomy researchers out to walk the levee that winter, cameras and soil probes in hand, and by spring 3 other farms along that road, Earl Castello's among them, had placed their own duck orders for the coming season, following a method they'd spent 2 years mocking because the yield sheet, in the end, argued more persuasively than Nora ever could have on her own. "Never thought I'd be asking a duck hatchery for a quote," Earl admitted at the co-op that spring, not quite meeting anybody's eye. And Vonda Ridley, ringing up his order, allowed herself the smallest of smiles without saying a word about it. Priya's study, published that summer in the state's Agricultural Extension Journal, under a title far drier than the story it told, credited Nora by name as the operation's originator, and included, in its appendix, a photograph of the boundary fence Nora and Dale had strung together that Saturday, offered by Priya as an illustration of the buffer standard other counties might consider adopting. Nora kept a copy of the journal on her kitchen table for weeks after it arrived, not out of vanity, she told herself, but because it was the first time in 3 seasons that the method had existed anywhere outside her own ledger and her grandmother's folded paper. Verified now in a form the whole state's agricultural community could read and, if they chose to, believe, Cody came back that 4th spring too, not as hired help this time but asking, a little sheepishly, whether Nora would take him on properly, teach him the whole system start to finish. Because he'd decided, watching 3 seasons unfold from the inside, that he wanted a farm of his own someday, built on exactly this kind of quiet, patient logic, instead of the schedule his own father still ran 2 towns over. Nora was 47 that spring, 3 full seasons into a method her grandmother had carried across an ocean, and half a century of silence before finally handing it to a granddaughter patient enough to prove it in ground that had never once asked to be proven anything. She kept her grandmother's folded diagram, brittle at the creases, in a small frame on the wall of the equipment shed where the brooder still stood ready each spring for the next batch of ducklings, and she found herself, some mornings, standing in front of it a moment before starting the day's work, the way another woman might pause at a photograph before leaving the house. She still walked the levee every morning with a feed bucket, still kept the ledger in her grandmother's old spiral notebook, its pages thickened now with 3 years of numbers instead of garden notes, and she had started, that spring, teaching a short course through the extension office for any farmer on the road curious enough to ask, walking them through the timing, the breed selection, the fencing, the whole quiet architecture of a method that had needed nothing from that county except somebody willing to try it long enough for the fields to answer. Rice doesn't need poison, she thought that spring, standing at the edge of a paddy full of ducks working steady through the shallow water, the sun catching on wet green rows that owed their color to nothing but sunlight, mud, and 40 birds doing a job no chemical drum had ever done as gently. It needs company. The thought carried none of the grief it had carried the night she'd sat with an unwritten ledger and a dozen dead birds in the mud. It felt, finally, like the plain fact her grandmother had always meant it to be, worn smooth from 40 years of repeating, finally landed in ground that had been ready, all along, to hear it. She thought, standing there some mornings with the feed bucket in hand, about how close the whole method had come to dying quietly with her grandmother in that small house at the edge of the farm. One more piece of knowledge nearly lost to a place that hadn't been ready to hear it the first time it arrived. It had taken a granddaughter with nothing left to lose, and a road willing, eventually, to let its own yield sheets do the arguing, before the sentence her grandmother repeated over a coffee can of feed finally found ground patient enough to grow it properly. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth keeping from it. The road hadn't laughed at Nora because they were cruel. They laughed because the method looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. Just a woman and some ducks in a rice field. No drama to it. No machine roaring. Nothing that looked like the hard work everyone already trusted. But the quietest ideas are sometimes the ones doing the most work underneath the surface. And a harvest, in the end, doesn't care who laughed at the ducks. It only cares what grew. If you've ever been laughed at for an idea that turned out to be older and wiser than anybody around you realized, tell us where you're listening from and about the person who first taught you to trust it. If this story found you today, share it with somebody who's still tending something the world hasn't caught up to yet. Whatever quiet method you're trusting through a season nobody else believes in, may your ground answer the way hers did. May your doubters come around gentler than you expect. And may the harvest, when it comes, speak louder than any laughter ever did.